I had 15 minutes of fame in the death trade, and I was everybody's idea of a good time for a very brief period. So a lot of notoriety, a lot of attention, a lot of banner headlines and so on. And I was routinely referred to as the angel of death, which is, your mother's not pleased if people start calling you that. But it wasn't inaccurate for all of that, and I did answer to it from time to time. So because of that notoriety, this young man was in touch with me. Here's the story of what took place. There was a man whose sweetheart had died recently, and her family had boxed him out of attending the official mourning for various reasons that seemed compelling to them then, at the time, but perhaps are regretted by some of them now. You'd think that the death of someone close to you is one of those moments tailored for deep decorum, when the best of you trumps the rest of you. But it isn't necessarily so. So this young man's plan was to have me accompany him on a prolonged road trip to a remote location in the northwest corner of the province, and in some ceremonial fashion consign the last of his sweetheart's things in his possession to the flames on an island that they had camped on years before. This is the instinct I was talking about earlier, right? You can hear it plain as day. He's not sure what he's doing, but he's brailing himself and me towards some kind of fundamental, pivotal, observable, ceremonial something. But he doesn't know why, and he doesn't know what, but there's something in there, yeah? The question is, should that something be served categorically without hesitation, question, or qualification? That's the question, and that's the question that informs the rest of the story. So the route up there brought us through a few of the northern Midwestern American states at a time when the convening of men's conferences in that area had begun in earnest. So this would be the early 1980s. These events had been brought to my attention the year before, and I just told you how. They seemed to have a tent revival tone to them, fraternal and redemptive and mournful and tribal. And a number of men whose ways I knew and respected found the ideas compelling and recommended them to me. And on the way back east from the ashen sorrow of that island ceremony, well, that young man and I attended one of these conferences. As it happened, the list of teachers included a few of the emerging luminaries whose names would become shorthand for men's work in the years to come. And if I mentioned all the names, I'm sure you'd know them all. I had read some of their work, and the whole business was by turns bewildering, enchanting, intimidating, and at times deeply inspiring. One of the last evenings was given over to a kind of culminating feast that was woven from what appeared to me to be threads of Carl Jung and Joseph Campbell and bread and puppet theater and Sufism and a kind of pan-African catechism and a kind of pan-Indian funky quotient, just to name a few. That sounds a little familiar to some of you, doesn't it? Now, as it went along this evening, this feast, which is a grotesque misnomer for what it actually was, as it went along, there was a spirit of rabid irreverence that began to claim the proceedings. Here's the shadow you're asking about. Rabid irreverence. Of course, if you practice rabid irreverence long enough, what does it become? Reverence. And you revere anarchy. The theatrics of the night included some kind of barely rehearsed play that held the teachers up to a consideration that went from lampoon to ridicule, depending on how crowd-pleasing a given teacher had been during the week or on how seriously he took his teaching assignment. Translation, the more serious he took his assignment, the more likely he was to be ridiculed in this play. This was where things flirted with anarchy and with cruelty, frankly, and a kind of group mind began to assert itself, whose project seems to include what the English call taking the piss, bringing down every raised-up person and idea, killing every Buddha met on the road. It is a volatile proposition to raise to a spiritual practice among a generation of men who, many of them, had deeply ambivalent relationships with cruel or remote fathers and with men in authority in a culture long on the entitlements of youth and privilege, which older men do not outgrow. It is certainly an idea that has enjoyed very quick uptake in the West generally, and I have no doubt that its popularity can be traced easily to the deep resentment heaped upon older people for getting what they could and for cashing in early, leaving the rest awash in indecision and in the particular tyranny of being leaderless. And James Hillman was among the teachers that night. He was reedy, he was a Yankee, he was a conservative, and he was brilliant in insight and speech, and he was, all in all, a necessary but anomalous presence in an event that was heavier on catharsis and tribalism and ecstasy than it was on the labors of learning. You can hear what my concerns are here now. Because there's nothing more that will provide you easy deliverance than catharsis and tribalism and ecstasy. His is what should be called a deeply achieved mind. But this very thing had begun to put him at a distance and a bit at odds with many of the younger men and the men of his age who were in attendance. Men who probably had had enough of feeling unequal to accomplished men well before they got to the conference. See the volatile soup you're proposing to engage in a rite of passage in. The point is that engaging in a rite of passage doesn't initiate anything. It's happening in an ongoing cultural context, and that's what lends it the lion's share of its meaning. Not what you intend it for, but where the instinct to do it is coming from. Yeah. He was admired in a way, yes, but largely because the titular head of the event, and that would be Bly, clearly favored Hillman's presence there, and so you could say that he was tolerated, and he was attended to, and he was envied, and he was inveighed against in equal measure. That's very volatile. And one of the principal fault lines running through men's work communities at that time was this deep, unnerving uncertainty about elders, about what might constitute elderhood, and about whether there could be such a thing any longer as elderhood, and about whether older men could be turned to and be trusted, and about whether older men were elders simply because they were old. And if you recall the 60s mantra about not trusting anyone over 30, well, you have some sense of the lineage of this misgiving. It was certainly talked about and conscious to some degree there, but it also lurked in the emotional wings, and it was sullen, and it was snarling, and it was seeking its time. And the generational fault line cracked open that night. One of the lampooning actors snuck up behind James Hillman and poured red wine over his head, enough to run down his shirt and his pants. And what I saw wash across his face in that a moment was acute anger at what seemed to him to be extraordinary indignity, and a spooked recognition of the aggressiveness that was suddenly swirling all around him, and an equal recognition that this calling down the mighty, it was in the cards, and it was set loose by the utterly disabling grief, illiteracy of the times. Not the grief of the times, the grief illiteracy of the times. And a catharsis junkie can't tell the difference between grief and grief illiteracy. They both feel bad. He was in the crosshairs of hurt right then, and he knew it. I sat maybe 20 feet from him, but all of that was legible on his face from that distance. And for a second, the group mind hesitated, wondering if it went a bit too far in this treatment of an older man. But the general hilarity continued, And the play went on, and Hillman was handed a towel. And he stood there where he was, shrugged, and with a frozen smile cleaned himself off as best as he could. In his demeanor, he went along with the tribe. But in his eyes, he was adrift in indignation. And it was a moment of frank, disfiguring shame. It had happened so fast that there was no interfering with it. But what did present itself to me in that wine-drenched minute or so afterwards was the possibility of going to James Hillman and helping him dry off, or of offering to fetch him a clean shirt from his room, or of just standing with him and apologizing. I did feel all of that run through me, and I'm deeply unproud to say that I did none of those things. I hesitated, as unsure as some others must have been, about whether this public shaming was somehow in the cards and part of the deal and mandatory for this friggin' movement. And I was ashamed to have been a witness to the thing, but in some fashion, not ashamed enough. Too young, too foreign feeling, not wanting to stand apart from this tribal jazz that I had sought out, and not courageous enough, I froze. And the moment passed. And years went by, as they do, and my life gained its few accomplishments as it can do. And I didn't think about that moment much at all, but I did get a bit older. You don't know you're getting older, as a rule, although the people around you seem to know that you are. Some invitations come in that are persuasive of the rumor of standing or notoriety, and they add to the evidence that time is gathering you as it goes. One invitation stood out for its mysteriousness. I was asked to attend a biennial meeting of the Jungian Congress, World Congress, as a presenter. I was to join a panel discussion, the panel's title being something like Jungian Analysts Meet Indigenous Healers. I don't know what you're laughing about. At the time, I was neither. I am still neither, it says right there. I asked the organizer what position they imagined me assuming in this discussion, given the title, given that I could find myself nowhere in the title. And I was told by them, "Oh, we know you don't belong in either group. As an outsider, well, you might be able to say the things that the others just can't say." Great reward for being non-aligned. Eh? So the unlikely thing went ahead, and it was well attended and seemingly pretty successful. And at the end of the second day, well, the idea was floated to head into the city for a celebratory dinner. So we assembled in the busy foyer of the hotel, and most of my party had began making their way to the taxi stand outside in the cold. But I was delayed in one of those revolving doors that hotels have, caught behind a slow, shuffling, mostly bald old man. And I saw them signaling for me to hurry, and I signaled back to them that the shuffler in front of me made it impossible for me to hurry over to my very important life. Eventually, he got clear of the door, and I came out behind him, and striding to my rendezvous with my taxi door open and one foot already inside, I glanced over at my obstacle, leaning on a cane, taking his place in the taxi line 20 feet from me. I'd seen him only once in my life, but I knew him instantly. James Hillman, now bent over and like the ancients of days, surrounded by handlers and luminaries at a conference for a special study session devoted to his life's work. It's the kind of accolade usually reserved for people who appear to be the tail end of their productivity or their lucidity or both. And I was cold, and I was spent from talking and contending all day, and I was being told to get in and shut the door. And I was awash in that memory from 25 years before. And I hesitated for a second. And you can think 100 thoughts in a second, it seems. Or be host to 100 have-tos in a second. Time slows down just then, but not in any way that helps you. It doesn't make more things possible. It makes more things legible. But seconds obey the passing of time more faithfully than we do, it seems. And they make their way through the revolving door of our attention span, and they come out the other side, over. We're the ones who do the lingering. And I wish I could tell you that the moment was redemption itself, and that the memory overcame my awkwardness in crowds, which I still have, and that I knew what 25 years ago asked of me, finally, and that I told the others to go ahead without me, and that I elbowed my way towards him and caught his ebbing attention and told him about the spilled wine and the ignominy, about how I should have stood for him because he was an older man and a wise man, and because he deserved better. And I wish I could say that he remembered, and that he thanked me for the consideration and for that moment, and that his handlers then whisked him into the cab and into his deeply achieved life, and that I watched that cab pull out into traffic with some wrong made better by finally doing the right thing by an old man. But I was in the taxi, and I was out into traffic before I knew it. And I looked back, but I couldn't see him. And so in the midst of a very expensive dinner in a very proper restaurant, surrounded by Jungians, I stopped the general conversation, and I told the story of that wine spilled. And I told it because of the memory, wishing that I'd done the right thing, maybe hoping that telling it was the next right thing, or the next best. I, for one, grew up with very few old people around me and fewer elders, and I had no training in the thing, in the particular skill of having elders. And during the unsteady course of my days, well, that is showed. And I read a few months later that he was dead. So, obviously an isolated occurrence, sort of. But I wasn't at many of these things, but one of the things I noticed, first of all, is the heavy reliance on the redemptive fact that if it was just segregated by gender, that sanity would prevail in a way that it never could without the segregation. Certainly saw that one. I saw the idea that if you were grieved, then your grievance was enthroned. I saw that. I saw people's sense of personal woundedness fetishized so profoundly that they became the stars of the show, as long as they cathected out loud. You understand what I'm saying? I saw the psychopomp, this extraordinary, agonizing drama play out itself over and over again, that the more wounded you were, the more authentic you were, the more reliable you were. It's kind of like the AA model gone completely out of control. And I guess I saw the idea that by virtue of being a man and knowing something of your hurt, you were inherently qualified in the life of a younger, perhaps less hurt man.